And so we're going to start the Chapter 6 lecture, which is titled How to Work with Controllers and Routing. Mainly, it's just about routing. And yes, to modify the routing, you will be modifying your controllers, right? But the routing is the URLs that our application works with. And so I find this chapter interesting because we talk about HTML, we talk about building websites, and we've built websites and we've built them in other languages, but never so much do we just focus on like what URLs should our application, what should they have, right? So this is a chapter that talks about, okay, you can kind of set your URLs up in different ways, and here's some recommendations, and here's how to set them up following those recommendations. So in the 2 years here, never have we really focused so much on the URL of our websites. So I find that interesting. I think it's kind of good that at some point in our 2 years, we talk about some best practices and some suggestions on how to make good URLs. And what are the benefits of having more user-friendly URLs and less user-friendly URLs? Because the other side of that coin, so one side is like, yeah, we're developers, we should code our URLs in a user-friendly and developer-friendly way. The other side of that coin is like for the most part, you're just clicking around the internet and you're just following links, and the links take you to where they need to go. So sometimes I see that side of the coin where it's like, yeah, do they matter? Yes, but to what degree do they matter? Again, I think they matter really in three ways. User friendliness, right? There's going to be some websites that have more user friendly URLs, and in general, that can help people understand your page a little bit. If you could just look at a page and you start to understand what the page might be about. But it's not even about the user friendliness and having a user see it, but also search engines. Search engines look at the URL and they can begin to understand a page based on a URL. Right, so as this book will touch on, it's good for user friendliness. It's also good for SEO, right? Search engines, obviously, you want to make websites that are accessible to Google, and having friendly URLs help with that. But it also helps developers. You have the end user that it helps, you have developers that it helps, and you have search engines that it helps. So those are kind of like the three customers, if you will, of your URLs. And this starts by basically going over the basically what's configured out of the box, and then we learn to customize it. And so that's basically what this chapter is, as well as best practices. So if you're looking at the objectives, that's basically what's covered. What is how it works out of the box? How do you customize that, and how should you customize that? Like, what are the practices around that? And then at the end, there's this thing called areas, which is pretty interesting because as we continue down the MVC world, we're going to learn how to do permissions, just like we learned how to do permissions in JavaScript. And these areas are kind of like setting up your folder structure to then later do permissions with. Okay, and you'll see what these areas are kind of at the end. So areas, this last objective, is just organization. You make these organizational areas, and then later you can work with permissions, saying you have permission here and you don't have permission here, is kind of the idea. And so with .NET Core, and they have versions of .NET Core, after 3.0, they have this concept called endpoint routing, and endpoint routing is what we're using. So that's just a new term that's introduced in this book. What is endpoint routing? Well, what is an endpoint? Ultimately, your endpoint is your method that you're calling. So basically, you give a full path to the endpoint. And so that's the way that routing kind of works out of the gate. If you look at your program.cs, there are these different methods, and this does a pretty good showing of like, hey, there's basically, this is what you get out of the box. And getting this out of the box, there's a couple of methods that they highlight. There's this use routing, and there's the map controller route, as well as add controllers with views. It's basically, the way I view it is you have to have these method calls for this endpoint routing to work, right? And you've basically worked with this as your template. So there's nothing new here. Again, we're just learning how does it work out of the box. Now there is a description as far as what each one of these will do for you. Like that first one, it says add MVC services. And that's what the book will tell you. It adds MVC services. Doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. Like, to me, what services is it adding? Meh. The way I look at this, these three methods that they're highlighting, add controllers with views, along with use routing, and along with map controller route, those are the three methods that are needed for this endpoint routing that basically says you go through a controller to get to a method, and in that method, you have some parameters that you might pass it. We are going to eventually start adding some other middleware, if you will, to do some different things between these different method calls. Yeah, what's up, Benny?
Is this entire chapter inside of the program.cs file?
No. We're starting there. Okay. And I think the TLDR that I'm trying to say is that, yeah, you got some method calls in here, and if you want this endpoint routing to work, how we've learned routing works out of the box, that's what is in program.cs. When you start customizing it, we're going to get into the controllers, right? So kind of going back to here, it says how to work with controllers and routing. So yeah, program.cs, but then we're going to get into some controllers as well to do what we need to do. Looking at that last line of code, and I think you guys, have seen that or at least paid attention to it. This sets up what's called the default pattern, and obviously there's two arguments to this method. So this map controller route is a method call, and you pass it two arguments. The first argument is a name. This is the default routing, so it's called default. The second is a pattern. We will start in this chapter customizing patterns and learning the benefits. So we start breaking this down a little bit and what this pattern means. When you see a pattern, there's basically dynamic data, which is in these curlies, and then there's static data. We haven't seen an example of static data in a pattern yet. Dynamic meaning, hey, I could have a products controller or a technician controller, right? And that's going to allow us, or a home controller, right? So dynamic obviously means that. Then in this segment, these are called segments. The segment for the controller can be dynamic names. So when you see these curlies, we're talking dynamic. If you just see a hard-coded word, that's going to mean static. Okay. This is essentially setting the default so that the home controller is kind of the default controller unless specified otherwise. Same thing, we have an action which is defaulting to the index. So home controller is your default, action index. So what that does, when you set this up, this pattern, these two options become optional, right? Because you have a default controller, you have a default action, and then this third part is also optional. It's like, hey, you can optionally, in the third segment, segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, the third section allows the end user or a link to provide an ID, which is also optional. So it boils down to all three of these are dynamic and all three of these are optional, right? That way when you load the home page, It's just the root of the application, and you don't have to say home index, anything like that. It just loads the page, right? So that's how it works out of the box. Like, again, bird's eye view. You got some necessary method calls that kind of configure services, whatever that means. To me, it's not that important. It just gets the job done. And then there is a default way that routing is handled. And you guys should be pretty used to that default way by now. That line of code, that last one, map controller route with name and pattern, could be replaced with this method call, map default. Notice this one doesn't have the word default on it. You could replace all of that with that. Okay?
All the same stuff.
Does the same stuff. However, recommendation is go ahead and continue leaving that in there, because that actually spells out what the default is, so that if you ever need to remind yourself or someone who's less familiar, you can explain routing using this pattern. Okay?
With the other method, how would you pull a slug into that? I guess the same way?
Yeah, so
Because here we just tacked it on to the end of pattern, right?
yeah, you can add other patterns. And so we'll learn, yeah, you could have another pattern with a slug on it. And what that boils down to is we'll do another method call here. So there's the default pattern, and we modified the default pattern to have a slug on it. But you can have multiple of these. And we'll get to when you have multiple, how should they be set up, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so point is, that last highlighted line of code and that line of code functionally work the same way. Okay, enough said. Again, new term is just each piece of that separated by slashes would be called a segment. First segment, second segment, third segment. The default route has 3 optional segments. If you were to just go to localhost 7098, it would load the home page, the index method. The third segment, Joel, it's important to note what that does. Joel in that case would be passed as the ID. And so technically, you are giving that page a little bit of extra information to work with, right? So you would have to have an index method. We haven't really done this, but in that case, you would have to have an index method that would accept a string, right? Because Joel's obviously a string. We've had methods, I think, that have accepted integers, like ID of 1, but obviously we're going to get into it where you can pass some strings. And so at the end of the day, I don't know when this is kind of a light bulb for me, where it's like, yes, this is an argument being passed into a method, right? And so I'm thinking back to like Sam, you had an issue where you left out one of those helper tags. Do you remember what helper tag that was on a lab? The ASP ID.
Oh yeah, he's at ASP4, I think.
ASP.
He was using for his label. It was like ASP4 or something.
Yeah.
I remember one
The route ID. ASP route ID. Okay. So we have these links that need an ASP route ID. Remember that? And then you do the @customer.id.
So that's what would be handling Joel in this situation.
This is exactly what puts the number into the link. Okay? So there was an aha moment for me. It was like, okay, this puts the number into the link, and from the link in that third segment, it's going to be passed into the method called index that has an int index. Right? Exactly. Exactly. So there was just an aha moment for me somewhere along the way that had to click. Right? Where it's like, okay, this is actually generating the URL. And then from that URL, this data, be it Joel that's a string or 3 that's a number, that would be sent into a method that accepts either a string or an int. And in this case, it's an index method that has int ID on the other end. Okay? So, does that make sense? But that was a good aha moment for me.
Before I kind of just thought, oh, it just works because it works.
Yeah.
But that makes more sense.
Yes. Beautiful. Okay, so again, you guys kind of know this. The first one's the controller. The second one is the method. They're called action methods. Why are they called action methods? Because they return an object that implements an iAction result interface. Whatever, they're called action methods. They're methods, okay? And they have to return a certain data type is what it boils down to. Remember, our class is public class student implements interface. And so what these action methods say is that whatever you return, if you're returning this data type, any data type works as long as they implement this specific interface. You can't return anything you want. It has to return a certain kind of object. That certain kind of object has to implement a certain interface. So that's what that language is when they're talking about that in the book. Blah, blah, blah. Talked about all that. So here's a bunch of examples. Again, this is just how it works. Because of our default route, you just go localhost. You get the default of controller, index, and null. You guys can look through the rest. I'm not going to read this to you. But take a look at it, and let's see if you have any questions. What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? Right.
On the last two,
Yep.
it just says detail and doesn't have like an ID, but it takes that ID instead of being null and makes it 0. Why does it make it 0 and not?
The book actually answers that question precisely. I highlighted that, and so I'm going to answer from you for right out of the book. Oh, no, I'm thinking of something else. Well, detail is a method that accepts an integer. So integers, I guess they can be nullable, but I don't think this one is, right? So you have to give it a number, and so it has to assume a default, therefore default is 0.
Could it be that that's like an add?
What do you mean?
Just like whenever you like do like an edit, then the ID would be 1. But if you're doing an add, then the ID would be 0. So
Well, think about a detail. The detail is a read operation, right? So you're not adding something new necessarily, you're editing something. Ready?
So, in the example you saw on the previous slide, you had /Joel, but it was being taken as an integer instead of a string. So, like in this scenario, you have /detail /3. Is there a scenario where you can take it as an integer but slug it as a string?
Two different methods. So one method has to accept one detail. If you write the details method to accept an int or a string, but it's no like mixing of the two.
Okay.
It's one or the
like
other.
An Amazon product, and it's product number 4020.
Yes.
But
yes.
The product itself is a basketball.
Yes.
Is there a way to turn that into, instead of just showing /4020, /basketball?
You're about 5 slides ahead.
Okay.
Yes. The answer is yes. This is just kind of how it works out of the gate, and then we're going to talk about how to improve it. So you're talking about how to make improvements, right? this is a controller, obviously. It's the home controller. And what I was saying just a minute ago is that our controllers have to return an object that implements a certain interface. And you can see that interface right there, iActionResult. So the main thing that we've done here is we've returned a view. And that kind of sends it off to the view, and the view can then handle that data, right? So what we've had in the past is return view, and then it just does what it does. But because we're just testing a bunch of URLs, right, and we're just getting used to like, hey, we're trying to change this and we're trying to make improvements here. There's another thing that you can return besides returning from a controller to a view. You could just return like a string. And it reminds me of when we were using Postman and we weren't really like putting it in a front end. Like we weren't really like returning data to a front end view. We were just returning data and then looking at it in Postman. It kind of reminds me of that. So here you just return, like we were returning JSON into Postman, and now we're just returning some hard content that says these different things. So, not too much here, but I'm gonna fire this up and do this because this will kind of help us going forward a little bit as we start changing our routes. And so, let me do that. Sure. I'll hop over into the right place, do it over there. Okay, so this is basically the home controller. And if I look at the home controller, we can delete these things here. Delete that should we choose. Public iActionResult return view. And instead of returning a view, again, we just return a content object that says home controller and index action. And if I were to make and so nothing really significant yet. Just kind of setting this up for some things to come. And I'm still launching in Firefox. Of course, we get the header contains invalid values at index 0, index action. Okay, so Control Z undo, bring it back to what it was. Home controller implements controller. Delete what you don't need. Return content. Oh. There we go.
Oh, it was like two different strings.
Yeah, I had it as two strings. It's one string. Okay. Home controller, one string, index action. Up. Sorry about that.
And of course, the error doesn't say, please make it one string.
No.
It gives you like 8,000 lines.
Yeah. So kind of load up the default there, home controller index action, but to get to the other one, we're going to go /home/about. Now we're home controller about action, right? So that's just default routing, and that again is just setting up for what's coming next. Okay. You know, I guess what is there really to talk about on this page? But a little bit. I think this is kind of new. At least I'm not remembering it. When you guys had like a list method before, did you accept any sort of inputs, or you just no? There were no inputs. And so again, I just want to reiterate this concept of like what is going into these methods is coming from the URL in one of those segments. We'll find out in like the best practices, it should be part of the URL as a segment, meaning separated by those slashes, not in a query string. Like this textbook says more or less, if you can avoid query strings, avoid query strings. And so if you do a /list, the default value there is accepted all. But if you pass any other string in there, like Bob or whatever was up there before, then the ID, because it's a string, will go to that method and be updated to whatever that value is. Okay, so a takeaway that I take from this slide is what's in those parameters, because you know when you're declaring a method inside of the parentheses, those are called parameters, right? The data that's sent into the parameters are called arguments. So that's just language difference there. If you call something an argument, that's the data you're sending to the method. A parameter is on the receiving end, right? So in that ID and ID, those are parameters. The arguments come from the URL. So that would be localhost /product/list/guitar, and you know, if you don't want to list all of them, you maybe write a little logic in there. If there's an ID, you know, then you can query based on that ID. And so, you know, really not necessary, I don't think at this point, but just to demo that, right, we can make a product controller. Kind of spin one up kind of quick, right click, add controller. Product controller. And let me bring in these methods. Public action result list string ID equals all. Let's put that syntax on it. And spin that up, boot up Firefox, /product/list. There you go. And if I put another slash there, again, this is the argument being sent in, so I can say list Bob, ID of Bob. Right? That was, again, a good aha moment for me, and I've probably said that 5 times now, so thank you for letting me repeat myself.
So it knows by default that if there's no parameter being sent in, or no argument being sent in, to just default to all.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's assigning a default value to ID, but it would be overridden, if you will, with an argument. Now, just to kind of public action result, and this is not something the book has, but if I do list int ID, and maybe we start the ID off at 0, return content okay. So again, if I go back to /product/list/Bob, okay, now this makes sense. It's having a hard time. It's having a hard time telling which one's an int and which one is a string, because one, I mean, in theory, could be a string, right? So I wrote this, but it says ambiguous match exception. Like, it doesn't know whether to send the 1 to the string or an int, because at the end of the day, it's coming from a URL. It's a string. Right, so that's an ambiguous match exception, so that makes sense. And pretty sure it doesn't matter the order of this, but I'm just going to do that just to make sure. That makes sense to me that that's working that way. Yeah, it doesn't. Now it doesn't work for strings or for ints. So that's, we've got an overloaded method, right? And that doesn't work very well here. So I'm just going to delete this one. But instead, let's continue with their other. So, to me, a list is typically going to be an all, but let's list a detail. Public action result detail and int ID. My hotkeys are failing me. Undo. Control save. Play. Okay, so now we're going /product/detail product controller detail action ID3. All good. And this is kind of, I think, going to help us as we start making improvements. We haven't made any improvements yet.
Yeah, would this work, what you're currently doing, with how we coded our case study? Like, we could have just inputted the int IDs in there, right? And it would have worked. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Now, if I leave the product detail off, this is kind of what Ryan was saying, like product detail it is going to default because it's an int. Because it's an int, it defaults to 0. And I did not have to do that here. Kind of curious if I do, if that even makes a difference. Product detail makes no difference.
What if it was like a?
Sure, let's.
If it was like another number, let's put that.
Sure, let's just throw 90 in there.
Default to 90.
Product detail ID of 90. Okay, good. So that's routing out of the box, and now we learn to customize routing a little bit. And so Vinny asked, is everything we're going to do inside of program.cs? It's like, no, but we are going to look at patterns and how to make our own patterns. And again, when we have a pattern that we want to add, we add it to program.cs. And so by default, controller is the first segment, action, ID is the third. This fourth segment has a static piece and a dynamic piece. So I pointed this out early is to say, hey, if it's in curlies, it's dynamic. But this allows us to say page 1, page 2, page 3. And so this num could then be used by our method to configure paging. Right? So our method, in this case, would be the whatever action. In this case, it's the list. You would be sending a value of 2 into this parameter called num that could be used to say, hey, instead of listing 50 products, list the products 10 through 20 on the second page. And again, takeaway on this slide is that we can configure static parts of the URL by putting them outside of the curlies. And that's not something we've done. So this is the first new thing. So we've learned something new today as far as how to do something new in MVC. Notice here, the name here, got to call out Sam again because Sam loves these conventions, right? That's my sarcasm. Yes, Sam, we love these conventions in MVC, right? So there's a convention here that the name of the variable in the URL has to match the name of the variable here. So the ID matches the ID. What it's not showing here is that this pattern right here needs to be added to the program CS to work. This is not out of the box. So in order for this list method to work that uses this new pattern where I can go into my URL and say page 1, I need to call this map controller route. Okay, so let me back up just a couple of slides. Okay, so this is adding a static piece of text to my URL called page. It allows me to say product list /all. That's going to be the third segment in page 1. So all becomes the ID and 1 becomes the page number. That could be one way of implementing paging, page 1, page 2, page 3. You could do the same thing differently by making the num its own segment. So notice this one, there's 4 segments, and they put the static piece of data right next to the dynamic data, and that's legit. This one is a longer URL. It's 5 pieces, but the static is completely separate from the dynamic. The book will later on, and I would agree, the shorter the URLs, the better. So like, if you're looking at these 2 things, if you're looking at slide 17 and slide 19, those are 2 different routes that do the same thing. The answer should probably be this one, because it's just going to create shorter URLs, and shorter URLs are better, is what it boils down to. Okay, now this is the line of code. Actually, this one right here that would add that into the program.cs. All right, so let's do that, and then we can use it, and then I'm going to send you guys on break. Okay, so give me 5 minutes, and we'll do that. Pull this over here.
Oh, so you'll have 3 different ones, you say?
Yeah, if you coded this, you would have 3 different potential routes that your website can use.
Yeah.
And so this one is 5 segments, this one's 4 segments, and this one is 0 required segments. The takeaway on this is they have to go top to bottom from most specific to most generic. Right? So this one's most specific because it's 5 required segments. You have to pass in all 5 if it's going to hit this one. Right? This one's 4 required segments. That's less specific than 5 required. Right? So it's going to use this one first if it's possible. If it can't use it, it falls down to this one. If it can't use that one, it falls down to the default route. And if your URL doesn't match any of those, then it's like, I don't know where to go. There's no endpoint configured for this. Error, right? Like everything else, error. Yeah.
So, I don't know if you said anything about anything here, but what's that sort by in that top one at the very end of the pattern?
Okay, this is an example of a static piece of text along with a dynamic piece of text. So a lot of times when you're paging, you're also sorting by, right? So you got customers, you're showing me the second page of customers, sorting by last name. So this little piece right here, sort by, that could be sent in and modify your query to the database, right? So you can modify your link query to the database based on this input to your method.
So that's not doing anything right now, it's just a variable?
Not right now, it's just a variable. That is right. But ultimately, that variable could be used to modify your link query.
Yeah.
Okay? So let me just add one of these. App.mapControllerRoute. It's a method. The first argument is paging. The second argument is the pattern. So again, kind of default routing, and this is one that allows us to change that.
Does the order that they're coded matter?
You mean, yes. And so the order that these are coded does matter. These routing options, we'll call them, must be coded from most specific to most general. Okay, and again, this one would be more specific because there's 4 required segments, and this one has no required segments. So that's more specific than that one.
Is that because if it doesn't have like each individual variable, then it'll just go to the next one?
Then it doesn't work. Yeah, then it doesn't work. Okay, so let's go back to our product controller now that I've got this, and let me make a list method. Now again, kind of going back here to our program, this list needs basically these 2 pieces from the URL, right? Our URL, we already have the controller name and the action name, product controller, list method. So I need a method that takes 2 inputs, an ID and a num. So I'll do, the book has a string ID, int num. So, right, so it lists a category. Maybe you don't want to list all, but you want to list all kids toys, right? So the category would be kids toys. Second page of kids toys, right? So now we have a custom route that's configured, and let's fire it up. And again, we have to remember that our page here, now this is lowercase, and so I'm gonna start by typing it lowercase. But we've got product controller, list action. I'm gonna say kids toys for the category, and page 3. Okay, so it says multiple endpoints. So let me bring this back to all. Let me see what I did wrong. Home product controller. Now that I've added this one, I'm going to delete this one. Because it's kind of the same thing. It probably didn't know which one to go to. So let's boot her up. There it goes. And if I change all to back to my kids toys, we got category of kids toys. And I did a lowercase page 3. I just want to see capital. Yeah, that makes no difference. So kind of the same problem I had before. I had 2 list methods. I didn't know which one to call. Did I click on Reddit? Yeah, it's coming, guys. It's coming. Did you know?
Back in people who are using their account on multiple devices.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to like re-log in at your home network.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on. Just want to point it out. You know, I think as we go through this class, you know, this program.cs will at least touch on all these different methods in here. This line right here, basically we said was needed for default for routing, for endpoint routing. So that's needed, and I'll even say part 1. Part 2. So like this line is needed for endpoint routing, part 2. And then these down here, these routes, are part 3. Right, just to kind of point that out, that we've now been exposed to these 3 lines of code that before maybe we just glossed over. And granted, we're we've at least been exposed to them now. Like we've touched on them. What's next? Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention. When we're making our own routes like that, they're just called custom routes, right? So we got some new language here. These different pieces are called segments, right? And when we're making our own routes, just custom routes. That's intuitive, right? It makes sense. The next piece is something called attribute routing. And so if I kind of pull up the PowerPoint and where we left off, now we get into working in a controller. So this is the home controller. If we're going to go to this about action as of right now, this is what we do. We boot this up. And there kind of is the default route, but we need to go /home/about, and that takes us there. But we can do this thing called attribute routing, where we add, and they call it decorating, by the way. We're decorating our methods with attributes. So I thought that was kind of a fun language. We're not just adding an attribute, we're decorating our methods with an attribute. This is the route attribute and about. What does this do for us? Well, it's actually kind of nice. Instead of having to go all the way here, now it shortens our URL. Because the home controller would essentially be assumed and adds the about. We haven't quite talked about the best practices, but what did we just do? We shortened our URL. What makes sense? Longer URLs or shorter URLs?
Shorter.
Of course, right? So shorter URLs. So plus if you go to a lot of websites, you don't need to go to /home/about, rankin.edu/about. Right? That extra /home doesn't really do a whole lot for you. You have any?
So this is like such good practice. How come, a website like Amazon has these ginormous links when you go to one of their products?
Yeah, well, those ginormous links have those long query strings, which aren't super user friendly, and if you can avoid them, then avoid them, and that's what this book's going to recommend.
Okay.
But what all that is, those query strings, is just, this is details about the page. Like this is content for use in the page. Decorating the about method with a route attribute for routing. Route.
You were talking about being able to see your search string up in the box. Working for the government, they found out quick that when they show that leaves it vulnerable to hackers to be able to see what they have up there, what they're looking for, and that. So they created a program that encrypted all that, so you could see the beginning of it, but it encrypted everything past a certain point to where you couldn't look and see what people were actually searching for, get any kind of details.
And that's probably what you're looking at when you're looking at Amazon, because it's gibberish up there.
Yeah,
It looks encrypted.
Yeah.
Right? That does make sense. Did you want to?
Yeah, so,
You're taking a picture?
yeah.
Okay, no problem. So let me switch on over since we've done some attribute routing. Let me switch over to my product controller. And we're going to do this over here. Again, this is attribute routing. Let me get rid of this equals 90 because that's just something that we were tinkering with. Close, minimize. Let's add in one over here, route. This one's going to be a little bit different. So this one has a static piece of text / product / ID. So let's kind of, right now, if we're going to go, if we were thinking about this route, it would be / product / detail / 3, right? Up until today, right? If we were going to go to this route, we were going to go / product / detail / 3. I just changed that to go to this detail method. We no longer have to have the / detail. So now it should be / product static / 3. Right? So controller, you're able to skip over the method and go right in. What did we just do? We shortened our URL again. Right? So let's plop that in and test it. So now I can do / product / 3, and there you go. It's still the same method, the detail action, but we shortened our URL. Right? Pretty cool. For the list, it's going to look very similar. This was kind of doing the paging thing. I'm going to take that out. We're going to take the paging out of our list. And we go back to assuming the ID of all. Always rebuild. And let's add in our routing attribute. We're decorating a routing attribute. Right on. Here we go. Route. Product / ID. And this one, optional, right? Because it can't assume a default, so we can make that ID optional. It's the same syntax as before. Static versus dynamic. And again, kind of thinking about what this used to be versus what it is today, what it used to be. So we'll call this old versus the new is just / product / 3. Right, so the old one here was / product / list. The new, and if there was an ID, you would say blah. The new / product / blah.
But why would you have an ID on the list?
Well, they're using that as a category ID, as in the category of toys or the category of
product / wheels or something.
Yeah, all the wheels of.
The wheels.
That's right. That's right. So you would use this ID as a category ID kind of thing. So back to this. Launch it up and / product / string ID, int ID.
Aren't you passing in all? Oh, okay,
There we go. So there's that, but now,
But you should be able to put in blah or
yeah, but again, it's conflict. Well, that was. Oh, products. Products. You got to be able to tell the difference between the routes, and so that's the third time I've basically hit the same error, right? And it has to be able to tell the difference between the routes. I made a typo. One is a singular product. One is a products. Products. Now the category is all, but tires, category of tires. And so, yeah, these are nice for shortening the URLs down. There's also because this is the product controller, a slightly different way to code this that would result in the same thing. And then you just put the word controller in brackets, and then it assumes product/ID. And that should still work. So again, going back to the /product singular and 3, that still works. Yeah, Vinny?
Can I see your program.cs file again? I think I might have messed up.
Yep.
Oh, so you don't have controller equals home on the custom one. You just have controller.
That's right.
Okay. I think that was my issue. No, I'm still getting 404 when I try to just do products.
I'll pause and take a look. One more attribute that you can decorate your methods with is, let me write the method, and you guys will remember, a slug is just a string in the URL that describes content on that page. And it kind of makes URLs a little bit more friendly. And we wrote this at least a couple of times by now. Am I right? This get slug. How many times have you guys written this kind of thing?
Probably twice.
A couple times.
Not
Point.
exactly, but in the classes,
In the model.
I try to do it for
We haven't wrote any in the controller.
out of the controller. I think we've done it all in the model.
and then we just referenced it.
Okay. Well, the point is that you might have some methods in here that are not meant for routing. And so regardless of what this method is doing, but it's not meant for routing. So since we're talking about routing attributes, non-action, right? So that just kind of marks that method as like not really significant for routing purposes. Clearly these other ones do, are meant for routing. Now, where I really like these, and again, it can kind of assume the controller. There's another one here that could be written like action, right? That automatically links up to your method name. So it's just another thing to keep in mind. I'm not going to do that here. But this automatically links up to this, and this automatically links up to that. I like these because they shorten my URLs. if you wanted to change your URLs, you think about product controller. Well, there is a kind of a default behavior. You can apply one of these attributes to the entire controller and change kind of how all the routing just works in that controller. So if I think about this, this changed routing on your whole application. These route attributes change it on an individual endpoint. But then you could also change them at the controller level and change routing just for that controller. And what that would look like, again, it's route. And I'm not a big fan of this because this is actually making the URL longer. Now to get to any of these routes, you got to type a /retail to make the URL longer, right? So if I were to kind of get rid of these, yeah, you're just adding, now you got to add retail. now your URL becomes longer. To get to this one, it's /retail /product /list /the optional ID of all.
So it's a little less code at the price of more URL.
Yeah, and it's just,
Yeah.
if adding that helps either the end user or helps developers understand what they're looking at, that's why you could add it. Or again, the end user, the clients of who really benefits from this, you can look at it from the 3 point of views that I said in the beginning. SEO, search engines, Google could benefit from updating your routes, end users, and developers. So if it helps any one of those three to have that longer or that extra piece of information, then you have it. So now let's pull up the list route that we just changed. We said a /retail /product controller /list. There you go. And so this is changing the routing for an entire controller.
I kind of like this. It makes a little more sense in my head.
Changing it at the controller level.
Yeah.
I get it. What if you just do this? /action /ID. Now we're getting kind of the best of both worlds, right? So now no, we just went /controller. Is that what we had? /controller /ID. So now /controller. Trying to get creative here. I got to bring back what we did. Let me bring back what we had before that had the shortened ones. This was /controller /ID. This was /controller /ID, but see, that doesn't work because this controller has an S on it. So you just can't do that in one file swoop at the controller level. Another way of changing router is at the controller. We've covered that. We've done that. Best practices for URLs. So here's a list of what's considered best practices. We covered that. Right? I think if you read this list, it's pretty intuitive, but we've never really talked about it. Keep the URL short while being descriptive and user-friendly. Use keywords to describe the content of the page, not implementation details. So in the URL, it should, describe content of the page. That's kind of the idea of a slug. Make your URLs easy for humans to understand and type. Like, I'm imagining calling someone on the phone and saying, type in this. It's only going to help to have easy URLs for people to verbally say, just go to website.com/products and you'll see it. Use hyphens to separate words, not other characters, especially spaces. Kind of fun little thing. You've heard of Pascal casing. You've heard, Pascal casing, capital P, capital C. You've heard of camel casing. Then there is kebab casing. Yep. And so when you use hyphens to kind of separate things, that's called kebab casing. And I like the name. Right?
Also very delicious food.
Yeah. Right? Everyone probably likes some kind of kebab. Right? And it's just, moving on. Prefer names as identifiers over numbers. What is that? What is prefer names as identifiers over numbers? Okay. /product/guitar is better than /product/3. Right? So product 3 doesn't mean anything to anyone. /product/ whatever kind of guitar makes more sense. Be consistent. Avoid the use of query string parameters if possible. So I think the whole idea behind this endpoint routing is it helps you avoid a lot of scenarios with query strings. Why avoid query strings? You might wonder, and I kind of thought about that. I think to the end user, they start seeing question marks and ampersand symbols and hyphens, and they go, well, I don't understand any of that. It's not easy to understand. And I think we've probably all been there at some point in time. All right, so product 1307 is not as friendly as product Fender Special Edition Standard Stratcaster. So this kind of goes from like worst to best, right? Product 1307 would be considered the worst. This would be better, but it's just a long URL, right? You could kind of shorten that up with a slug to be Fender Special, right? So with a number, no good. With a name, that's better. But a name and descriptive but short is even better. And then again, query strings are those things that we built in JavaScript that start with a question mark, and then every piece of data is separated with an ampersand. So our first piece of data was category ID. The second piece of data is page. Right? So in this world, we prefer putting our information in those segments as opposed to the query strings. Again, kind of good to better, right? You're using the names, but they're a little longer, and then these just are a little bit shorter. So product list could be changed to products and give you the same result. Product list guitars could be product guitars. Products list guitars page 1 could be products guitars page 1. Just shorten it up. And all that's done with that attribute routing. Last thing before we actually do a little coding thing together, before we do an exercise. They have a feature, if you want to call it a feature. I'll call it a feature called areas, very simply. And these areas are an organizational thing, just another folder, if you will. And in those folders, you create subfolders for controllers and views. So just like right now, we've got one folder for these different things. Notice areas is right underneath the root, kind of in line with controllers and models and views. So if I were to create an areas folder here, this is a convention, so it does have to be named properly. So let's just add a folder called areas. And subfolder to areas would be our first admin area. So new folder, admin. And these are just done with folders. There's really nothing special here besides making folders. And then under admin, we'd have controllers and views. Add a folder, controllers. And add folder views. Now your models aren't necessary because the idea is this: your general users might be able to view products, right? So you're going to provide one view to your standard users, but once a user authenticates and they're given permissions, right, you might be able to add new products here. So you put add products, because right now everyone can just add a product, but in the real world that's probably not the case. So you're probably going to make a user log in, we'll get to it, and then you put that add product logic under this area, which you border off with the permissions. So you got to authenticate to get in. You're going to notice a lot of the same names. So like you've got a home, view, and index.cshtml. Of course, it's a different folder, so it's allowed to have the same names.
So as opposed to like just switching certain features on and off, like with permissions, they actually see a whole
different HTML view. And you'll notice right here, here's an admin layout CSHTML, right? So you could give them their own, yes, they're completely their own HTML views. View imports, view start, you give them their own, you give them their own pages. Completely separate from your standard users, which that would just stay in here. So now we can list our products, we can detail our products, but now to add or update a product or delete a product, you have to be an admin, right? So this is just setting it up so that in the future we can add these permissions, right? Once we get into authentication and that kind of jazz. That's really step one, is making the folders and getting the files in there. Step two is adding a route for your admins to access those controllers and those views. So just only difference is it's got that keyword area. And Ryan, you now know, because I think you typed that earlier.
Yeah.
Didn't you?
Yeah,
IntelliSense had him typing map area controller instead of just map controller. And so now you know what an area controller is, right? It's something that we'll use for permissions.
Yeah.
Okay, step one, I'm sorry. Did I say 2 steps? I should have said 3. Step 1, create the folder structure, create the files. Step 2, update program.cs for your routing. Step 3, mark it on your controllers as an area for admin. Do you think the area name has to match area name admin, area admin? Do you think that has to match?
Probably.
And the folder name.
And the folder name?
I'm gonna go with yes.
Yeah, I'm going to go with yes as well. So yes, the area name here absolutely needs to match the area here. So to get into the product controller, you need here slash area. So don't know how much we'll be doing this right now until we start dealing with authentication. But it is kind of forward looking. You put it in here because it does deal with routing, right? Now we have this whole area called, localhost /admin /product/ad kind of thing. Chicken before the egg. Egg before the chicken. All right, awesome. And the last thing that we'll do is an exercise on page 229. You guys feel free to follow along. Did you download the student files?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. And if you downloaded the student files, are you able to get chapter 6 EX1 routing practice?
Let's see.
Where were those at? Files?
They're on the Muroc website.
And you gotta go to the book, and then you gotta go to the page, or the free downloads tab.
It's a who.
Is it under book apps or X
It's
examples?
starts, and then routing practice.
So EX starts routing practice. See, these exercises are in the back of every chapter. We haven't really been doing them because we've just been doing all the other stuff. But why not? We've got the time.
Sure.
And it's
Someone can put the link in the chat.
yeah. Would someone just make a downloadable link or give them the full path on chat?
Yeah, the problem is they make you register.
You can put contact information.
Yeah.
So we have the student files. We're going to open up
Good catch.
chapter 6 routing practice. Step number 2, open the program and notice it has the default route. We've got the default route. Open the home controller. Notice there's a couple of things going on there. Home controller returns content of home, return content of privacy. Run the app. Accept the risk and continue. /home. Oh, of course, it's not set up to do just /privacy. You have to go /home/privacy. /home/privacy will get you to return privacy. That was step number 5. That was steps 4 and 5. In the home controller, view the code for the display. Okay, so here's our next one called display. And if there's an ID, no ID supplied. Otherwise, it spits out the ID. Makes sense. So we'll do /display, no ID supplied, /3, ID of 3. And it's like, oh, you could, again, see how this could be used querying data out of a database with link, right? That was step 7, 1, 2, 3 ABCs, what it tells you to put in there, 1, 2, 3 ABC. Add an action method that uses the default route. So we're going to make something called countdown. counting down, colon. For loop for tab, int I equal to ID, while I is greater than or equal to zero. Decrement I, we're counting down. That's what that for loop's going to do for us. We're going to start at 3 and we're going to go down to 210. Content string plus equals I and a line break. Pretty straightforward what that's going to do if we boot that up. Save it, run it. /home/ count down /10. Counting down 10.
I did 1,000. What about?
Counting down from 1,000. Where does it break is the question.
I found the break
Where you found the break?
at 20 billion.
Yeah, it breaks quicker than that. Mine broke at like 100.
Mine broke at 100K.
Yeah.
Weak.
What about 99?
What about, yeah, that's right, 99999. It broke.
Just because there's not enough like RAM allocated, or
Well, yeah, because an int can store billion, like positive 2 billion and negative 2 billion. So certainly it's within the scope of an int. So yeah, it must just be taking too much resources to, I don't know. At the end of the day, here's probably what's happening. Your browsers have certain, like, the website's asking me to do an unreasonable task. It's requiring too much resources, kind of thing. Okay, so now that's the default routing, so now we get to customize it, right? So that was the first part. Dealing with routing. Now we're gonna change it up with some attribute routing. Add a route attribute. Decorate countdown. Route. Action / optional ID. So now we can just say /countdown 10. We don't have to say /home. /countdown /10.
can't we do that at just the controller level, and then we don't have to
Yeah.
do that for every method?
Yeah. So the question is, what if we just put it here?
Yeah.
Put it at the controller?
For some reason that just makes so much more sense in my head.
Well, no, it works well here. I can't say it's going to work well in all cases, but that does work, right? And then /privacy. Get you there?
I see the
Yeah, so this is the route that we added. And, Vinny's question was, can you put it on the controller and not put it on the individual method? And it does work in this case, but again, I don't think it's going to work in all cases. Okay, so note that you only have to type the name. I'm going to put it back to where it told us to put it, so I can continue. So that, don't show again. And again, I'm going to boot it up and just make sure it's still working. Okay, so that shortens our URL. It says, note, you only have to type in the name of the action and the value of 10, not the name of the controller. If you do use the old syntax, though, this is kind of where, if you do /home countdown 10, that doesn't work. Says that is because the routing attribute for countdown method overrides the default route, right? So it's overriding the default route, so this is no longer available. I'm on 14 of 230. It says in the countdown method, change the name of one parameter from ID to num. ID to num. Change the name of the parameter from ID to num. However, in the route attribute, continue to use ID as the name of the second segment. Run the app and test the countdown method without an ID segment. It should work correctly, so I got to change this to num as well, so it compiles. So even though it's called ID here, it's called num here. Test it. Countdown /10. This should only display the default value of 0. That's because the segment name of the route attribute must match the parameter name in the method. So they're just demonstrating, again, the convention. This has to match that. Otherwise it breaks.
So if you change that to num as an optional parameter.
It says in the route attribute, change the second segment from ID to num. So if we change this from ID to num, run the app. There it goes. It brings it back to working. Step number 19 of 23, and then this hour-and-a-half video is over. Edit the countdown method so it includes 3 parameters, and edit the route attribute for this method so the segment's names match. So here, so I is going to be start. I is equal to start, while I is less than or equal to end. It's kind of, I think, the part they don't really explain. Modify the code for the countdown so it starts counting down at the start. It does explain it on step 20. Ends at the end and displays the message. And displays the message parameter when the countdown is done, which is liftoff. And then, so what you do is you do content string plus equals message. Okay, so here's basically what I've added to my loop. And that kind of gives us some flexibility. You have to do /countdown, and the start is required. So if you just do /countdown, that's not going to work. But if you say 5, it'll count down to 0. If you say /5/1, 5 to 3. So start, end, and message. Boom. 5, 4, 3, boom.
Just taking the parameters from the URL and using them as variables in the
Bingo.
in the function.
Bingo.
So,
5, 1, lift off.
and what happens if you just use the start? You only do start?
It'll assume the 0,
Oh.
end is 0, so it'll start there and end at
Defaults to
0. Yep.
And then message is
Empty.
empty.
Yep.
That's cool.
Yep. Awesome. Routing in ASP.NET Core MVC.